It started with the need to get away. I had been working nonstop for almost 10 months, stuck in the same routine every single day. Wake up early, eat something quick, sit at my computer until it got dark, and then go to bed too late. I wasn't sleeping well. My back ached from sitting too long. My mind felt foggy all the time. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't remember what day it was, and everything I did felt automatic. I needed a break before I burned out completely. I found the cabin on a rental site I had never used before. It wasn't listed on any of the bigger websites. The photos showed a small wooden cabin tucked deep in the woods, next to a narrow lake. The place was remote. No nearby towns, no neighbors, no cell service. Exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for a week. The plan was to drive up, bring some food and supplies, leave my laptop at home, and not think about work or anything else for the next 7 days. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 2 hours were on dirt roads that twisted through thick forest. My GPS lost signal halfway in, and I had to rely on a printed map I had saved just in case. The sun was low by the time I arrived. The cabin was even more isolated than the pictures had shown. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The lake behind it was silent and still, like glass. I couldn't hear any birds or insects. It was so quiet it made me stop and listen for a moment, wondering if something was wrong. But there was nothing, just pure silence. I unlocked the cabin with the key from the lockbox. Inside, everything was simple but clean. A bed, a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a single wooden table with a chair. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, no microwave. Just the basics. I unpacked my things slowly, placing my groceries in the tiny fridge and folding my clothes into the dresser. As I moved around, the wood floors creaked under my feet. It wasn't creepy, just old. The kind of noise you expect in a place like that. That first night, I sat on the small porch facing the lake. I had a flashlight in my pocket just in case, but I didn't turn it on. I watched the stars appear, one by one, as the sky got darker. Without any city lights nearby, the stars looked brighter than I had seen in years. The water was so still I could see the reflection of the trees on the far side. I felt like I was in a painting. I went to bed early. I thought I'd have trouble sleeping in a new place, but I was out within minutes. The quiet helped. No traffic, no phones, no noise. Just the soft sound of the wind through the trees. The second day was uneventful. I made breakfast, read a book I had brought, and walked along the edge of the lake. There wasn't much of a path, but I followed the shoreline, stepping over rocks and tree roots. I found an old dock about half a mile away from the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The boards were soft and warped. Some were missing. I didn't trust it enough to step on it, but I stood nearby and looked out across the lake. It was strange how flat and still the water was. I threw a rock in, expecting to see ripples spread out, but the surface settled almost instantly. That night, I sat by the fireplace inside. I had brought some firewood and I got a small fire going. It warmed the room quickly. I lay on the floor on a blanket, staring at the ceiling. I didn't think about work or bills or any of the things that usually filled my head. It felt good. I felt calm. It was the third night when something started to feel off. I had just turned off the lights and gotten into bed when I thought I heard something outside. A soft sound, not an animal or the wind. Something heavier, a crunch like a footstep on leaves. I sat up, heart beating a little faster. I waited, holding my breath, but didn't hear anything else. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably a branch falling or maybe a deer walking by. I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no footprints, no signs of anything disturbed. I shook it off. Being out there alone, it was easy to let your imagination play tricks on you. The stillness could make anything feel more intense. I went about my day like normal, read more of my book, cooked lunch, took another walk, this time in the opposite direction along the lake. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I couldn't relax the same way. I kept listening for sounds, waiting to hear that noise again. Around midnight, I heard it. This time, I was wide awake. It was definitely footsteps, not animals, not branches, real footsteps, I stayed perfectly still. The sound came from the side of the cabin, near the porch. They were slow, deliberate steps, one at a time, then silence. I held my breath for what felt like forever. I didn't want to move or make any sound. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and look through the front window. There was nothing there. I looked out for a long time, but I couldn't see anything. Just the trees and the lake and the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I walked the entire area around the cabin. Again, I found nothing. No tracks, no damage. It was like no one had been there. But I knew what I heard. I wasn't imagining it. That evening, I debated leaving. I still had 3 days left, but I was no longer comfortable. The silence that had felt peaceful before now felt suffocating, like the trees were closing in. I decided to give it one more night, and if anything else happened, I'd leave in the morning. I didn't light a fire that night. I kept the lights off and stayed in bed with my flashlight. I didn't want to be visible from outside. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time. Then a sound that made my skin crawl, the creak of the front porch boards. I knew that sound. I had walked across them many times already. Someone was on the porch. I didn't move. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped. For a long time, there was silence. Then, a faint sound, like someone gently trying the doorknob. I felt paralyzed. There was no lock on the bedroom door, just the main door which I had locked. I waited, heart pounding, afraid to make any sound. After a few minutes, the porch creaked again. The steps moved away slowly. Eventually, everything went quiet. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When it was light, I opened the door and looked outside. Nothing. No signs of anyone. I didn't care anymore. I packed my things as fast as I could, tossed them in the car, and left. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. A week later, after I got home, I still couldn't shake the feeling. I kept thinking about the sounds I heard. I knew I hadn't imagined them. I emailed the owner of the cabin and told him something strange had happened. He responded the next day, saying he didn't know what I was talking about. He claimed the area was completely private and that no one else should have been nearby. I let it go after that. But a few nights later, I was going through the photos I had taken during my trip. I hadn't looked at them until then. Most were just of the lake, the trees, the dock. But one picture made my stomach drop. It was a photo of the cabin I had taken the first night, just before going inside. I hadn't noticed anything unusual when I took it. But in the photo, near the edge of the trees, there was someone barely visible. A figure mostly hidden in shadow, just standing there. I zoomed in as far as I could. The person was wearing dark clothes. No visible face, just standing at the edge of the woods, watching. I never saw them with my own eyes, but they were there. They had been watching me from the moment I arrived. I deleted the photo, shut my laptop, and sat in silence for a long time. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I never will. I had been working from home for over a year, and I was starting to feel like the walls were closing in on me. My apartment was small, noisy, and always full of distractions. The constant city sounds, the never-ending stream of emails, and the stale air of my place were wearing me down. I needed a break, not just a day off. I needed to disappear for a while, a change of scenery, so I decided to rent a cabin out in the woods. No neighbors, no traffic, no internet, just trees, birds, and silence. I wanted that silence more than anything. I found this cabin online. It looked simple but clean, just one bedroom, a kitchen, a small bathroom, and a fireplace. It was tucked away deep in the forest, about a 3-hour drive from where I lived. The listing said it had solar power, a well for water, and a small backup generator in case the solar system failed. That was enough for me. I packed up my car with some clothes, a bunch of canned food, bottled water just in case, a few books, and my laptop, though I didn't plan on using it much. The drive up was nice. The roads gradually got quieter, and the landscape turned greener. Paved roads turned into gravel, and finally into a narrow dirt trail lined with thick trees. The air smelled fresher the deeper I went. When I reached the cabin, It was late afternoon. The sky was still bright, and I was surprised by how quiet it was. No sounds of cars or people, just wind through the trees and the occasional bird. Felt good. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but it had a charm to it. A porch with a wooden chair, a small shed out back, and tall pine trees surrounding it in every direction. The forest was so thick you couldn't see very far into it. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place smelled like old wood and something earthy, like moss or dirt, but it was clean. The kitchen had a small fridge, a gas stove, and a counter. There was a little table with 2 chairs. The bed looked soft enough, and the fireplace already had some logs stacked nearby. I spent the first night settling in. I cooked some pasta, lit a fire in the fireplace, and read a book until I got tired. It was strange going to bed without hearing sirens or loud neighbors, just the sound of wind and the occasional creak of the cabin walls. I slept hard. The next few days were peaceful. I hiked during the day, taking trails that looped around the cabin. The forest was dense but beautiful. Green moss covered fallen logs, and patches of sunlight made the undergrowth glow. I saw a few deer and a fox once, but no people. I liked that. In the evenings, I cooked simple meals and watched the fire crackle until I fell asleep. I didn't touch my laptop once. By the 5th day, though, I started noticing little things. The first was the trail behind the cabin. It was barely a trail, just a narrow path through the trees, but I hadn't seen it before. It looked like it had been used recently. The leaves were pushed aside, and some of the dirt looked fresh. I didn't remember walking that way, and it wasn't on the small map the cabin owner had left. Still, I figured maybe it was just a deer path or something. I didn't think much of it. That night, I heard something outside. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, and I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure what woke me, but I sat up in bed and listened. At first, it was silent. Then I heard it again, soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. They were slow, spaced apart, not the quick steps of a rabbit or fox. I stayed still, heart pounding. I listened for maybe 10 minutes, but the sounds faded away. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear. That seemed more likely than a person. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever it was had been close, too close. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked outside. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but then I walked around the side of the cabin and saw what looked like a footprint in the dirt. Just one. It wasn't clear, just a slight outline, but it was definitely from a shoe, not a paw. It wasn't mine. I hadn't walked there. The ground was soft from some rain 2 nights ago, so it must have been recent. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to figure out what to do. There was no cell service out here, and the nearest town was about 30 miles away. I decided to stay calm. Maybe someone had been hiking and passed through. Maybe a hunter. The woods were public land, after all. But I kept the axe from the shed inside with me that night, just in case. That night, I didn't sleep much. I left the lights off and kept the fire low, trying to listen for any noise. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, just a low creaking sound, like wood bending. Could have been the porch. It was faint, but it was there. I held my breath and stayed still, clutching the axe. Eventually, the sound stopped. I sat in the dark for hours, not moving. The next morning, I found more signs. Near the edge of the woods, behind the shed, the grass was flattened, and there were more faint shoe prints. Someone had been back there. I checked the shed. Nothing was missing or disturbed, but the door was slightly open. I always closed it. I started to feel watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like someone was out there, just beyond the trees. I kept checking the woods, scanning for movement, but I never saw anyone, just trees. I stopped going on hikes. I stayed close to the cabin, windows locked, door always bolted. At night, I blocked the door with a chair. I didn't light fires anymore. I didn't want to give away my position. Then, 2 nights later, I heard something I'll never forget. I was lying in bed, barely able to sleep, when I heard a knock on the wall. Not the door, the wall. Just one knock, like someone had tapped on the outside wall with a knuckle. It It was slow, deliberate. I froze. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. No more knocks came, but I knew someone had been right there, just outside the wall where my bed was. The next morning, I packed everything. I didn't care about the remaining food or the books. I loaded up my car and left. The dirt trail was rough, but I didn't stop until I hit the gravel road. I drove straight home, not stopping for gas or food until I was hours away. I didn't feel safe until I was back in the city, in my noisy apartment surrounded by people. It took me a while to calm down. I kept thinking about those noises, the footprints, the knock on the wall. I still don't know who it was. Maybe just some creep living off the grid, watching cabins like mine. Maybe someone who liked to scare people. But I know they were out there, and I know they were watching me. I was lucky I left when I did. I never reported it. I didn't see the point. No one was hurt, and I didn't have any proof. But I told the cabin owner to check the place, and I left a review warning others to be careful. I haven't gone back to the woods since. Not alone, anyway. Now, when I want quiet, I take a walk in a park or put on noise-canceling headphones. I don't need total silence anymore. I've learned that sometimes silence isn't peaceful. It's a sign that something's watching, waiting, just beyond the trees. It started with a need for space. Not the kind you ask from a person, but the kind you crave when your life feels too loud, too crowded, and too fast. I had been living in the city for years, waking up to sirens, rushing to work through jammed traffic, sleeping with headphones to drown out the neighbors. I wasn't burned out exactly, but I was close. I felt thin inside, like everything that used to feel full had been scraped hollow over time. I wanted somewhere quiet, just me, a forest maybe, a cabin if I could find one cheap, somewhere I could reset. I found the listing on a back page of an old online forum. It was barely advertised. The photos were grainy, like they'd been taken with a disposable camera. A small wooden cabin tucked deep into a forested area somewhere in the upper north. No town nearby, no real address, just GPS coordinates and a note that the nearest paved road was about 12 miles away. The description said it had solar panels, a wood stove, and a deep well for water. No internet, no cell service, and definitely no neighbors. That's what sold me. I sent the owner a message, wired the deposit, and a week later, I was packing up my car. The drive out was long. I passed the last gas station and didn't see another person for over an hour. The roads turned from asphalt to gravel, then finally to dirt. I followed a handwritten map from the owner, turning at tree markers and old signs, crossing a shallow creek, and crawling up a narrow path that barely looked like a road anymore. Eventually, the trees opened up to a clearing, and there it was. A simple, weathered cabin with a tin roof, a small porch, and a stack of firewood leaning against the side. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. It was dead silent. I unloaded my gear and stepped inside. The floor creaked, but everything seemed solid. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch with faded fabric, and a narrow staircase leading up to a loft with a mattress. There were shelves full of old books, an axe hanging on the wall, and a giant cast iron stove in the middle of the main room. The windows were dusty but intact. I spent the first few hours cleaning, checking the solar battery, and collecting more firewood. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I woke up with the sun and made coffee on the little stove. I read books I hadn't touched in years. I hiked trails that hadn't seen footprints in a long time. I sat on the porch at night and just listened. No horns, no yelling, no buzzing lights. Just the wind, the occasional owl, and the soft creak of trees swaying. I finally started to feel like myself again. But then things started to shift. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small things. One morning, I woke up and found the axe missing from the wall. I figured I had left it outside by the woodpile, but when I went to look, it wasn't there. I searched around the cabin, checked the porch, even walked part of the trail I'd taken the day before. Nothing. It was gone. I tried not to let it bother me. Maybe I dropped it somewhere and didn't notice. A couple nights later, I woke up cold. The stove had burned out, which wasn't unusual, but when I got up to throw more logs in, I noticed the front door wasn't latched. I always latched it. Even though no one was around, it was just habit. The door wasn't wide open, just slightly ajar. I stepped outside barefoot, shivering, and looked around with a flashlight. Nothing but trees and silence. I closed the door and tried to shake off the unease. The next morning, I found boot prints in the dirt just off the porch. Not mine. They were larger, deeper, like someone heavier had walked by during the night. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were old, that maybe they'd been there the whole time. But they hadn't. The rain 2 days earlier had turned the dirt to mud, and the prints were sharp, recent. I felt a tightness in my chest I couldn't explain. I brought the firewood inside that day and kept the door bolted. That night, I stayed up late. I left the lights off and sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around me. The moon was out, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat there for hours watching, listening. Nothing, just trees. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. A slow, dragging noise. I pressed my ear to the glass. It was coming from behind the cabin, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound stopped. I stayed there until the sky began to lighten. I went outside as soon as it was bright enough to see. I walked around the cabin, looking for anything out of place. On the far side, near the well, I found what looked like drag marks in the dirt, like something had been pulled through it. There were no footprints this time, just the long, curving grooves through the leaves and soil. They led back into the woods, disappearing into the brush. I didn't follow them. I told myself I needed to leave, that this wasn't what I'd signed up for. But a part of me didn't want to give in. I had come here for peace, for control. I didn't want to run the moment things got weird, so I stayed. I built stronger locks on the doors. I boarded up the downstairs windows. I kept the axe from the shed next to my bed. Every night, I sat by the window in the loft, watching the clearing. I started hearing things more often. Snapping branches, the rustle of leaves when there was no wind. Once, I swore I heard breathing outside, just below the window. One morning, I found a rabbit nailed to the front door. I didn't touch it. I backed away, locked myself inside, and didn't come out for the rest of the day. By the next morning, it was gone. No blood, no nails, just gone. Like it had never been there. A week passed. I barely slept. I started talking to myself just to hear a voice. I thought maybe I was going crazy, maybe the isolation was getting to me, but I knew what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. Then it got worse. I woke up one night and felt a draft. I turned over and saw the loft window wide open. I had locked it. I always locked it. I got up, walked over, and slammed it shut. When I turned around, there were muddy footprints on the loft floor, bare feet. They led from the window to the stairs and stopped. I grabbed the axe and searched the whole cabin. No one, nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I packed a bag. I was done. I didn't care how far the walk was. I was leaving. I gathered my gear, grabbed what food I could carry, and headed down the path. I walked for hours. The sun was high when I stopped to rest. I looked around and realized something that made my stomach turn. I had seen this exact clearing before. Not one like it. This exact one. The same twisted tree, the same fallen log. I had been walking in circles. I took out the map. It didn't make sense. I had followed the markers. I had turned where I was supposed to. I kept walking. Another hour. Then 2. Still the same trees. The same shapes. It was like the forest wouldn't let me go. That night, I made a fire and stayed awake. I didn't want to go back to the cabin, but I couldn't find a way out. The fire kept me warm, but the woods felt like they were watching me. I saw shadows move between the trees. I heard breathing again, closer this time. I held the axe tight and stared into the dark until morning. First light, I ran. I didn't follow the path. I just picked a direction and ran. I tripped. I fell. I scraped my arms and tore my pants, but I didn't stop. I pushed through thorns and branches, my legs shaking, my lungs burning. Then finally I saw it. A road, a real road, gravel but wide with tire tracks. I fell to my knees and laughed. A ranger found me a few hours later. He said I was lucky, that most people who wandered off trail didn't make it out. I didn't tell him about the cabin, about the rabbit, about the footprints. I didn't want to sound insane. I told him I got lost on a hike, and he drove me into town. I stayed at a motel that night, a cheap place with stained sheets and buzzing lights, but it felt safer than that cabin ever did. I checked my phone for the first time in weeks. There were missed messages, emails, updates from work. But there was also something else. A message from the cabin owner. It was dated 2 days before I left. Just checking in. Wanted to let you know the last guest didn't come back. If you see anything strange, don't stay too long. That was it. No explanation. No warning. Just that. I didn't reply. I didn't call him. I deleted the message, shut off the phone, and fell asleep with the lights on. I never went back. I never looked up the coordinates again. I don't camp anymore. I don't hike. I live in the city now, surrounded by people and noise and light. Sometimes at night, when it's quiet, I hear the sound of footsteps on wood. I tell myself it's the neighbors, that it's nothing, but I still lock every window, every door, and I never, ever leave the axe out of sight. It started when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. I'd been burnt out from work, exhausted from the noise of city life, and I just needed silence. No phones, no traffic, no people. I found the cabin through an old acquaintance who had inherited it from his uncle. It wasn't listed online or anything, just a quiet, hand-built wooden structure surrounded by miles of forest, sitting at the edge of a small, still lake. I didn't think twice. I packed up some essentials, bought enough food and water for the week, and made the drive. The drive itself was long and quiet. Once I left the highway, the road turned into narrow gravel paths that twisted through dense trees. I didn't see another car for miles. No phone signal, no houses, just trees that closed in on the road like a tunnel. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. And that's exactly what I wanted. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the treetops. It was small, just one room with a tiny kitchen, a bed, a wood-burning stove, and a bathroom with cold water only. No electricity, just an oil lamp on the table and a few candles scattered around. Outside, there was a small porch facing the lake, and an old wooden dock stretching a few feet into the water. The silence was overwhelming. No humming of lights, no distant sounds of traffic, just the wind brushing through leaves and the occasional creak of the wooden boards under my feet. I unloaded my supplies, lit the lamp, and set up for the night. There was a notebook on the kitchen counter, yellowed pages with a few entries scribbled in pencil. Looked like someone had kept track of food supplies or chores. Nothing strange. I went to bed early that night with no phone or light to keep me awake. The darkness felt heavier out there, like a thick blanket pressing down on everything. I woke up once in the night to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like a footstep on dried leaves. I stayed still, heart picking up a little. Then nothing, just the wind again, probably an animal. I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I made coffee on the old propane stove and sat on the porch watching the fog roll across the lake. It was peaceful, still, and cold. I stayed outside for hours, just thinking, writing a bit, watching birds land on the water and take off again. I didn't plan on doing anything that day, just reading, writing, maybe a walk through the woods later. In the afternoon, I decided to take a trail that started behind the cabin. It wasn't marked or anything, just a worn path that led into the trees. I walked slowly, taking everything in. The forest felt untouched. No rappers, no signs, no sounds of planes overhead. After about 30 minutes, I came to a small clearing where an old shed stood, half collapsed and covered in moss. I peeked inside, just some rusted tools, broken shelves, a torn-up mattress. Maybe someone used it for hunting a long time ago. I didn't stay long. That night, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, this time slower, heavier. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. They circled around the cabin, then stopped near the porch. I waited. Nothing. I blew out the lamp so I wouldn't be seen from outside and listened. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard the steps again, walking away toward the woods. I didn't sleep well after that. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks. The ground was mostly pine needles and dry leaves, so nothing would leave a clear mark unless it rained. Still, something felt off. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a bear, even though it didn't quite sound like that. I kept busy during the day. Went back to the trail, walked farther this time. Found a stream, watched a squirrel for a while. Tried to enjoy the peace, but my mind kept drifting back to the sound of those footsteps. The way they stopped near the porch. The slowness of them. That night, I moved the small table in front of the door, just for peace of mind. I kept the lamp off again and lay in bed, fully dressed, just in case. Around 2 in the morning, the sounds came back. But this time, they didn't circle. They came straight up to the door. I could hear the boards creak on the porch. Then nothing. Just silence. I stayed frozen in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The next morning, I found the table slightly moved, just a few inches, but I knew I hadn't touched it, and the door was closed, locked. I checked it 3 times before going to sleep. Still, something had pushed the table. I walked around the cabin again, even checked the shed in the woods. Nothing. No people. No animals. Just that same feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I considered leaving, but I'd promised myself I'd stay the whole week. Besides, I didn't want to look back and feel like I'd run from nothing. That afternoon, I didn't go far. I stayed near the cabin, kept my knife in my pocket, watched the woods more closely. On the 5th night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up with the lamp off, sitting at the table, just listening. The wind came and went. The trees creaked. Then, just past 1 in the morning, I heard something tapping the window. Not hard, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking with a fingernail. I didn't move. The window was behind me, and I didn't want to turn around. It stopped after maybe 20 seconds. Then I heard footsteps again, walking along the side of the cabin, toward the back. I sat there until the sun came up, barely blinking. I knew something was out there now. Not an animal, not a trick of my mind. Someone was out there, watching the cabin, watching me. I went outside as soon as it was light and searched again. Nothing. No tracks, no signs, but the window had smudges on the glass. Long, thin smudges like someone had run their fingers down it. I didn't touch it. I didn't even clean it. I just stood there, staring at it, my stomach churning. That day, I packed everything up. I didn't care if it was early. I was done. I didn't feel safe there anymore. I loaded the car, double-checked every door and window, and started driving out. But not even 15 minutes down the road, I saw something that made me hit the brakes. There was a man standing at the edge of the trees, just off the road, dressed in dark clothes, beard, dirty hands. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stared at me as I passed. I didn't stop. I just kept driving, faster and faster, heart pounding. I didn't look back again. I made it home late that night and didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't want people to think I'd imagined it. But something had been out there with me in those woods. Someone. And they'd been coming closer each night, testing the doors, watching from the trees. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I called the guy who'd given me the cabin and asked if anyone else had ever stayed there recently. He told me it had been empty for years. Nobody but me had been out there. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him what I saw. I just said thanks and hung up. I haven't gone back since. I've stayed away from remote places altogether. I still hike, still camp sometimes, but never alone. Never that deep into the woods. And I've never heard footsteps outside my window again. But I think about it often. The tapping, the movement of the table, the smudges on the glass. I don't know what that man wanted or how long he'd been out there, but I know he was real. And I know I was lucky to leave when I did. Maybe he was just watching. Maybe he was planning something worse. Either way, I was alone in that cabin, miles from anyone, and something was standing outside every night, getting a little closer, waiting for me to fall asleep. It was late September when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin I had rented deep in the Adirondack Mountains. I had been working remotely for months and was getting tired of the same routine, the same apartment walls, the same city noise. I needed to get away from people and screens and the constant buzz of notifications. I wanted real quiet, thick trees, no cell service, no neighbors. I found the listing for the cabin through a small rental site. It wasn't fancy, but that's what I liked about it. It looked old and simple. The pictures showed a small log cabin with a metal roof, a stone chimney, and a wooden deck out front. The surrounding trees looked untouched. The owner had written that it was accessible only by a rough dirt road and there were no nearby houses or cabins. That sounded perfect. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. The last 20 miles were slow and rough. The road turned from pavement to gravel and then to a winding dirt track, overgrown on both sides with wild brush. My car wasn't made for off-roading, but I managed to crawl through, branches scraping the sides and bottom. There were no signs and no signals, just thick woods, uneven ground, and quiet. The moment I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt the silence settle in. It was the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. The kind you only hear when there are no cars, no people, not even wind, just trees and air. The cabin was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 by 30 feet, made of old logs that had turned gray from age. The roof was rusty in places. The porch steps creaked as I walked up with my bags. There was a single door in the front and a narrow window on each side. Around back, there was an outhouse, tilted a little, and a shed that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I walked inside and found it dusty but clean enough. It had one main room with a small wood stove in the center, a cot with a thin mattress in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, and some shelves along the wall holding old pots and cans. There was a stack of firewood by the door. No electricity, no running water. Just an oil lantern and a water pump outside. Felt like stepping back 100 years. That first evening was peaceful. I unpacked some food, walked the area a bit, and read a book until dark. I lit the lantern and kept the door open for a while, watching the last bit of light fade from the trees. It got cold quickly, so I built a fire in the stove and listened to it crackle while I lay on the cot. I fell asleep early. The next day, I explored the area more. The woods were thick and untouched. I followed a deer trail for a while until it faded into nothing. There were no other trails, no trash, no signs of other people. Just endless trees and underbrush. I gathered some kindling and cut some more wood from a dead log I found. I cooked simple meals, rice, canned beans, soup. I spent the day reading, chopping wood, and sitting on the porch. It was exactly what I needed. But by the 3rd day, I started to feel like something was off. It wasn't anything I could explain. There were no noises, no animals, no clear signs. But every now and then, I'd get this feeling like I was being watched, like someone was in the trees, just out of sight. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen a single soul since I got there, and the road was so bad I doubted anyone would just show up. Still, the feeling kept coming back, especially in the late afternoon as the light started to dim. I'd find myself looking toward the woods more often, noticing shapes, shadows. At one point, I thought I saw something move behind the trees. Not a person, just movement. It was gone the moment I looked at it directly. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I wasn't used to this kind of isolation and my brain was playing tricks. That evening, I built a larger fire than usual. I kept the lantern close, even though I didn't like wasting oil. I closed the door early and locked it. I even moved one of the chairs under the handle. It was an old habit, something I did when I lived alone in the city. I hadn't done it since moving into my apartment, but it made me feel better. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound felt amplified. The creak of the walls, the wind pushing against the roof, the crackle of cooling metal on the stove. I kept waking up, heart pounding, sure I had heard something outside. I got up around 3 a.m. and opened the door, just to check. The fire I had left burning in the pit had died down to a dull red glow. The woods were black beyond the reach of the light. I I saw nothing, heard nothing. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I told myself I was being stupid. I decided to distract myself with something physical, so I hiked deeper into the woods. I didn't go far, just enough to find some fresh deadwood. I marked my way with small stacks of stones and broken branches so I wouldn't get lost. I took my time and tried to let go of the uneasiness, but it followed me. At one point, I came across what looked like a very old campsite. Just a circle of stones and a rusted canteen half buried in the dirt. It was overgrown, forgotten. I didn't like standing near it. That night was worse. Started around midnight. I had been asleep for maybe 2 hours when I heard something outside. Not an animal. It was steady. Slow footsteps on the gravel path near the porch. Then silence. Then one soft creak, like someone had stepped on the first wooden step. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My heart was racing. I lay there for what felt like forever, staring at the ceiling, listening. Nothing. I didn't hear the steps again. But I didn't go back to sleep either. At sunrise, I opened the door. The gravel looked the same. No prints that I could see, though the ground was hard-packed. The porch was empty, but something was wrong. One of the stones I had stacked to mark a trail was on the porch step, just sitting there. I had left those deep in the woods. No way it ended up there by accident. That shook me. I picked it up and threw it as hard as I could into the trees. My mind was racing. Either someone had followed me, or there was something I didn't understand happening here. I spent the day packing. I didn't want to be there anymore. I kept looking toward the woods. I kept expecting to see someone, but I never did. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I left the firewood, some food, everything I didn't need. I loaded my car and started driving back down the dirt road by late afternoon. That should have been the end of it. But the road wasn't the same. There were trees across it in places. Not a lot, just 2 or 3, like they had fallen in a recent storm. I hadn't heard any storm. I had to get out and move them. Took me over an hour. My hands were raw, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. Once, while dragging a branch, I thought I saw someone standing in the distance, just off the road. A tall figure. I stared for a long time, but it didn't move. Then it wasn't there anymore. I drove as fast as I could, wheels slipping on the dirt. The moment I hit gravel, then pavement, I felt a weight lift. The cell signal came back an hour later, and I called a friend just to hear someone's voice. I didn't tell them everything, just said the trip didn't go as planned. I didn't report anything. What could I say? There was no proof, no crime, just strange signs and feelings I couldn't explain. But I never went back. Weeks passed. I started sleeping better. I got back to work, to city life. But that trip stayed with me. The silence, the feeling of being watched, the stone on the porch. I'd find myself thinking about the cabin more than I wanted to, wondering if someone had been living out there, unnoticed, watching people who came and went, maybe following them. I started checking the locks twice at night. I stopped hiking alone. I didn't feel safe in the woods anymore. One day, months later, I checked the rental site out of curiosity. The cabin was gone. The listing had been removed. I tried searching for the owner's name, but the page was blank. No trace, like it had never been there. That was when it really sank in how alone I had been out there. How vulnerable. If something had happened, no one would have known for days, maybe longer, and I kept thinking about that stone. Whoever left it knew where I had been, what trail I had taken. They wanted me to know they had seen me. I didn't go back to the woods after that, not even close, and I still don't know what I walked into. But I know this, it wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was something worse. It was real, and it's still out there, somewhere in those trees, waiting for the next person who thinks they need a little peace and quiet. It started out as a plan to get away from everything for a while. I had been living in the city for too long. Too many sirens, too much concrete, too many people in a rush to be somewhere. I needed silence. I needed nature. I needed space to think. That's what led me to rent a small cabin up north, deep in the woods, a few hours' drive from where I lived. I found it on a site that listed remote vacation rentals. It wasn't anything fancy, just a wooden cabin near a small lake, with no neighbors nearby and no phone signal. That's exactly what I wanted. The pictures showed a peaceful spot, a tiny dock on a still lake, a few pine trees surrounding the cabin, a small fire pit outside. Inside, there was a basic kitchen, a fireplace, a couch, a bed, and not much else. The kind of place where time slows down. I booked it for 2 weeks. The drive up there was peaceful at first. Long stretches of winding roads through forests, the trees getting taller and thicker as I went. After the last town, I still had about 40 minutes of driving through unpaved roads. My car rattled as I navigated over potholes and loose rocks. I started seeing fewer signs of people. No other cars, no houses, no stores, just trees and the occasional deer darting across the path. When I finally arrived at the cabin, I turned off the engine and just sat there for a few seconds, letting the silence wrap around me. The place looked exactly like the photos. A single-story wooden structure with a tin roof, the lake shimmering quietly behind it. The trees around it were tall and dense, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. I took a deep breath. It was quiet in a way that almost felt loud. No engines, no people, just the wind moving through the trees and the soft creaking of branches. I carried my stuff inside, unpacked, and sat on the edge of the dock for a while with my feet dangling above the water. The first few days were peaceful. I would wake up with the sun, drink coffee on the steps, walk through the woods, read on the couch, and watch the water. I cooked simple meals, listened to the birds, and went to sleep early. There was no signal and no internet, and that was fine with me. I felt like I was getting my mind back. By the 5th day, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things, like how the woods suddenly felt different when I walked through them. Before, it had felt open and calm. Now the trees seemed closer. The shadows seemed darker. I chalked it up to my imagination, maybe just adjusting to the isolation. But then I started noticing sounds. They weren't loud, just quiet things. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, footsteps maybe. But when I stopped and listened, everything would go still. At first I thought it was animals. Probably was. But the sounds were slow, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. I didn't see anyone, and there weren't any houses around, so I pushed the thought aside. I told myself I was overthinking it. One evening, I was sitting by the fire pit outside, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. I had a small fire going, just enough to keep warm as the temperature dropped. I was halfway through a beer when I heard something in the woods to my left, a soft crunch, like a foot pressing down on dried leaves. I turned my head sharply, but there was nothing. I stared into the trees, but they were just shadows and darkness. I waited, nothing else. I threw another log onto the fire and tried to ignore the tight feeling in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening. The cabin creaked sometimes. It was old and would expand and contract with temperature, but this felt different. It felt like something was brushing against the outer wall, just a light scraping sound. I stayed still, trying to breathe quietly, my eyes wide open in the darkness. It went on for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. I didn't get out of bed. I stayed awake until the sun started to rise. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. I looked for tracks or marks, but the ground was too hard and dry to hold footprints. The wall where I thought I heard the noise looked normal. I still couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't go into the woods that day. I stayed close to the cabin, sitting on the dock, keeping my ears open. Around mid-afternoon, I saw something across the lake. Movement, something dark between the trees. I stared hard, but it was too far away. I couldn't make out what it was, just a shape. Then it was gone. The next morning, I found something strange on the porch. It was a rock, just a plain gray stone, but it hadn't been there the day before. I would have noticed it. It was placed right in the center of the porch, not dropped or rolled there, but set down. I picked it up. It was warm. I don't know why, but I didn't like that. I threw it into the woods. That afternoon, I finally decided to walk back toward the road. I hadn't done that since I arrived. I figured I could clear my head. The trail was narrow and slightly overgrown. After about 20 minutes, I saw something odd. A rope. It was tied between two trees, about waist high. Not blocking the path completely, just hanging loosely. It looked like it had been cut on one end, frayed and dangling. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I kept going for a few more minutes, but I felt watched. The kind of feeling that crawls up the back of your neck and makes your skin tighten. I turned back and walked faster than before. That night, the scraping came back. This time it was louder, more aggressive. It wasn't just one spot. It was all around the cabin, like something circling, dragging something along the walls. I stayed in bed again, frozen. I didn't have any weapons, just a flashlight and a kitchen knife. I thought about grabbing the knife, but what was I going to do? I didn't even know what was out there. It went on for over an hour. Then silence again. The next morning, I packed. I had 7 more days left in the cabin, but I couldn't stay. My mind wasn't calm anymore. I felt like I was being hunted. I loaded everything into the car and got ready to leave, but the engine wouldn't start. It just clicked, then nothing. I tried again. Same thing. The battery was fine before. I checked the hood, but I don't know much about engines. Nothing looked out of place. I walked around the car and froze. The tires had been slashed. All 4 of them. Not a little puncture. Deep slashes. Long gashes in the rubber. Clean cuts like from a knife. I backed away and sat on the porch. My hands were shaking. There was no cell signal, no landline, no neighbors. I had no way to call for help. I decided to hike back to the road. I packed a small bag with water, a flashlight, and a few snacks. It was early morning, so I had enough daylight. The road was about a 45-minute walk. I figured I'd flag down a car or walk to the nearest town. As I walked, I kept looking behind me. Couldn't help it. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. About halfway there, I stopped. There was something hanging from a tree branch just off the path. I stepped closer and saw it was a dead bird, a crow. Its neck was broken and its wings were spread wide, tied to the branch with string. Below it, on the ground, was another rock, just like the one from my porch. I left it and kept walking. When I reached the road, I felt some relief. I stood at the edge for a while, waiting. No cars came. I walked along the road, heading in the direction I thought the last town was. After nearly 2 hours, I finally saw a truck coming. I stepped out and waved. The driver slowed down and stopped. I told him my car broke down and I needed a ride to town. He didn't ask many questions. He dropped me off at a gas station. I called a tow truck and a mechanic. When we got back to the cabin the next day, the place looked untouched, but the slashed tires were still there. The mechanic took one look and said someone had done it on purpose. He asked if I had any enemies. I didn't say much. I just told him to fix the car. While he worked on it, I packed everything. I didn't want to stay one more night. I didn't even want to go inside, but I needed my things. The inside of the cabin was just like I left it, except one thing. On the kitchen table, there was a third rock. Same size, same color, just sitting there. I picked it up and saw something scratched into it. Letters, just 3 letters. My initials. I left that place and never went back. I didn't tell anyone the full story. People would have said I imagined it. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe it was all in my head. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I didn't imagine the slashed tires or the dead bird or the rocks. It's been months now. I live back in the city, but I still feel it sometimes. That feeling of being watched. Sometimes I wake up and think I hear scraping. Sometimes I check my front step and half expect to see another rock. So far, I haven't. But I moved to a different apartment anyway, just in case. I had been working from home for over 2 years straight, staring at screens day and night. My head felt heavy all the time, and I was tired of the noise from traffic outside my apartment in the city. One night, after another long shift, I finally decided I needed a real break. No screens, no emails, just a place where I could breathe again. I started searching for isolated cabins online, and after scrolling for hours, I found one deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It wasn't part of any resort or managed campground. Just an old wooden cabin sitting by itself on private land, owned by an old man who barely used it anymore. The photos looked rough but livable, and that's exactly what I wanted. Somewhere quiet and real. I packed my car with enough supplies for a full week. Non-perishable food, water jugs, a first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, a portable stove, clothes, boots, and a few basic tools in case anything broke. I also brought my sleeping bag and a thick wool blanket. The cabin had no electricity, no cell service, and no running water. That made it perfect. The drive took about 8 hours from the city. The last 30 miles were rough, dirt roads full of potholes, tall trees on either side, and no sign of another human anywhere. The GPS cut out about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin. I had to rely on printed directions I'd written down before I left. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the tree line, and the air had that crisp bite that told me night was coming fast. The cabin looked like something from another time. The wood was dark from years of weather, the roof slightly sagging on one side. There was a small porch with 2 broken chairs and a crate that looked like it had been used as a table. I stepped inside and was hit with the musty smell of wood, dust, and something a little sour, maybe from a mouse that had died somewhere inside. The single room was small but enough. There was an old iron stove in the corner, a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a bed frame with a thin, sagging mattress. I opened the windows to air it out and started unpacking. The first night was calm. I boiled water on my portable stove, made some instant noodles, and sat outside in the growing darkness. I hadn't heard another voice in hours, just the occasional rustle of wind through trees or the sound of something moving in the underbrush, probably deer or raccoons. I felt peaceful. That night, I slept in my sleeping bag on top of the mattress. I kept the flashlight by my side, more out of habit than fear. The next few days followed a quiet rhythm. I would wake up early, cook something simple, go on long hikes through the forest, and return before dark. I had no connection to the outside world, and it felt like I was slowly peeling off layers of noise from my mind. My thoughts became clearer. I wasn't thinking about work or emails anymore. Just the sound of my boots on leaves, the way the trees creaked, and the sharp smell of pine. But around the 4th day, something started to feel strange. It was small at first. I noticed some of my food containers had been moved. Not opened, just shifted slightly. I thought maybe I had done it without noticing, but I always put things back in the same spot. Then I found muddy prints near the back of the cabin. Too large for a dog, definitely not a deer. They were boot prints and they were fresh. I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived. No cars, no hikers, no voices. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe they were old and I just hadn't noticed them earlier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, hearing noises outside, sticks snapping, leaves crunching. I stayed still, holding my breath. Every time I turned on the flashlight and looked out the window, I saw nothing, just black trees. I told myself again it was probably just animals, maybe a bear, but bears didn't wear boots. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I saw more boot prints, this time circling the backside. Some prints were deep, like someone had stood still for a long time. I checked all the doors and windows again. Everything was shut tight, but I couldn't stop thinking about how far I was from anyone. If someone was out here watching me, they could do whatever they wanted, and no one would know for days, maybe weeks. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed most of my things that day, keeping only what I needed for the night. I'd leave first thing in the morning, but just as the sun was going down, I heard something loud in the woods behind the cabin. Not just a branch breaking, this was different. A crashing sound, followed by silence. I stood frozen in the middle of the room. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like someone was running through the forest. I turned off the lantern, grabbed my flashlight and knife, and crouched near the window. I aimed the flashlight out the back window and clicked it on. Nothing but trees. I waited, heart thudding so hard I thought it might echo off the walls. Then something moved, just for a second. A flicker of movement behind a tree, far out in the darkness. I kept the light steady, but whatever it was didn't move again. I stayed there for hours, barely blinking. Around midnight, the sound stopped. I locked the door, blocked it with the table, and sat in the corner, knife in hand, waiting for morning. At first light, I threw everything in my car and started driving. I didn't care about the speed. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. But about 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. On the dirt road behind me, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. A man, dressed in dark clothes, maybe wearing a hood. He wasn't walking, just standing there watching. I didn't stop to get a better look. I kept driving until I hit the main road, then kept going another 3 hours before I even considered stopping. When I finally got home, I didn't unpack for days. I left the bags in the corner of the room and just sat in silence. I thought about that figure in the woods, those boot prints, the noises at night. Someone had been watching me the whole time. They never approached directly. They just watched, waited. Maybe they were waiting for me to slip up. Maybe they just liked to scare people. I'll never know. I looked up the cabin again a few weeks later. The listing was gone. I tried contacting the man who owned it, but there was no reply. Eventually, I stopped looking, but I never forgot the way it felt to know I was being watched. The silence of the forest that wasn't really silent. The footprints that weren't mine. The figure in the mirror that didn't move. Now, when people tell me they want to get away from everything, to find peace in the middle of nowhere, I don't say much. But I always think about that cabin. How peace isn't always peaceful. How quiet isn't always safe. I still go hiking sometimes, but I never go alone, and I never go too far off the map.